let's get the world experts involved on that. So without further ado, Steve Tremblay is going to give you a presentation on governance. Now, Steve has been a longtime member of the executive over in ISACA Ottawa, and we're very privileged to have him. He's got probably 30 some odd years worth of experience. He spent more than 25 years, 20 years in the Canadian Armed Forces, communications, electronics, and cybersecurity. And he's basically got every certification known to man. And at the same time, he has his consulting company, Fafaldi. And what he also does is participate not just in teaching and consulting the standards, he helps in developing as well. He's a lead for Canada for ISO 20000, ISO 38500, ISO 3150, and he's involved in the organizational governance ISO as well. So he's been working in this area for nearly 12 years. So this is we're very privileged to basically have him speak. And certainly, if you have any questions, I don't know anybody who's better suited to ask to basically answer them. And he can tell you what's happening now, but he has a good insight as to what's coming down. What's coming down in the future. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Steve Tremblay. Thank you very much for giving a presentation. And I want to thank Steve Laverne also for getting this and getting this presentation sorted out. And at the end, after Steve Tremblay, I'd like Steve to give a few words on what is coming on in future events. Okay, so Steve Tremblay, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bob, for this great introduction. Very appreciated as well. And well, I won't keep you all hanging really on the subject, so I'll go right away into what I wanted to cover today. And this is the agenda. The goal wasn't really with that presentation to go and explain exactly in detail what is governance, but we still have to start from that. But the main goal is to, yes, circle back to what ISACA as tools so that you could benefit from being able to use these tools and define your own governance systems, but also bring in perspective what has been going on within the International Standard Organization. So there's already a standard that has been there for quite a while, which is the 38500. And there's one that is upcoming that is the 37000. And so I will introduce you these two standards. And in fact, the 38500 is really a series, and the same thing for the 37, which there's a series of a few standards. And between these and COBIT from ISACA, any organization, any people is really well prepared to be able to attack defining their own governance systems for their organization. And I say their own because, well, as we know or we will see, governance is really based on a specific type of organization. It's not something that is defined and that's what you take as a best practice and you apply it to your organization. You really have to define what you need to have and how far you need to go with governance. Nowadays, well, we all hear the buzzwords, and the digital transformation is what is really going on. Is it new? Is it not new? In my perspective, it's not very new. I mean, since the day that we started to define the computer and get that to be present in every possible areas, we're digitally transformed organizations and transformed ourselves as well in our personal life. So information and technology, that's what we're aiming here with the aspect of digital transformation. So it's not IT as the information technology department. It's the information and the technology that is used by any business units within a typical organization or any entity that is a part of an organization as well. The idea is for the organization to manage that properly. And without being able to have a proper governance system, it could go all over the place. And it could be that we're going to avenues that are not really required for us, and that's not going to help our organization at all. So if we think of transforming, the idea is that, well, one thing is we need to know why we need to transform, who do we need to serve, and what exactly then we need to do to transform so that we get to serve these stakeholders properly. And that means as well, well, we are going to validate eventually that what we've done, part of our digital transformation, has created value for these stakeholders. And so that means that that governance has to go a little bit more than just, well, here's what we should be doing, and go ahead and make it happen. That's one part. But there's the part of what we need to be able to confirm and be accountable to what we committed we were going to do. And that's also part of what we say as governance. I wanted to put that here because when we talk about governance, I mean, we've heard about the term governance for quite a while, but it goes even further than what we may even think. And you see here that, well, the root of the verb, the word governance, goes back to the Greek verb kuberno or kiberno, in the sense of, yes, leading, as I mentioned before, the possibility of leading, so it's not all given there, and steering. And so how can you lead if you just provide that direction, but you have no way of seeing how that direction is followed? Because you could provide the direction today, but things are going to change as you move forward. And so you need to be able to be aware of what's changing and keep looking at it as well at the direction that you provided. And is it still going right? And do we need to make any adjustment? So you need to be able to steer as well. And so when we start to look at those really definitions of the roots of those words, we get to understand a little bit more as to how far governance can be going. So again, going back to what we see here, what they call the centrality of information and technology in most enterprise for being able to deliver value, and so generate the value that all of the stakeholders expect to have, while maintaining a good usage of the resources. And so balancing the usage of resources, what we have and what we can afford, but also managing risks associated with that as well. Because we know that we're going to have multiple ways of proceeding, and in the end, some ways would be better than others. And so we have to be able to manage what's the best to pursue. So the enterprise governance of information and technology is what we see as really emerging in the past few decades. And COBIT, as we will see a little later when I go back to it, has been at the forefront of this. With the previous versions and all the way to now, the new version that has been introduced last year, where we take it even more specific to what we're trying to provide you as guidelines and tools is for the enterprise. It's not just for IT. And that's why in the last version of COBIT, we went with the enterprise governance of information and technology. So as it is evolving in any business units within any type of organization. We should also all know that, yes, when we talk governance, obviously it starts at the very top of the organization, but it doesn't end there. It has to first enable the business and the people within the organization to be able to follow that direction. And so we need to provide just a bit more than just the direction. We need to provide the right resources so that that direction can be further defined as to how we can achieve it and get to be implemented through different processes, different people and abilities and competences in place so that we get ultimately to deliver the value, all along to make sure that we can measure as well what we're doing. There's a good picture here on, again, showing the full model there of where governance starts and where does it end. And I like that picture because, yes, it starts from the top. So it's very much a top-down approach because, yes, it is the executive boards that will start the ball rolling with that very high level direction to the organization. But then some people have to take that direction and decide how best we can achieve it. And that's when we get to senior management, where the direction and the proper oversight will be taken over. And that's when we strategize as to, well, what exactly we're told to do, how best to do it, can we do it or not? Are we already doing part of it and some not? And get to have strategic plans in place, which then within management can be used as we move forward through programs, investments that we're going to make, portfolio investments that will lead those programs or initiate those programs, and get to implement whatever we need to have in place or whatever is missing in place, so that ultimately we get at the worker level and they can do their work and they know what to do. They know what to expect on how they should be doing it. So the level of performance, this is all measured, and they get even feedback as to how well they also do the work, which that feedback that we see on the right side, coming from the left side that provides the directions down all the way down to the worker level, goes back up and feeds back all the way to the top, to the governing body, where they can be accountable to the different stakeholders, which will be all kind of stakeholders here. We see a regulator, but there's many stakeholders that could be involved, including customers, clients that we have to serve. There's a on the left on the slide, it's a fairly busy slide. There's those elements there of processes, organizational structures, policies, procedures, and so on. These are really enablers for governance to function properly. If we provide a direction, but we don't have within the organization, or we don't ensure we have proper processes, proper organizational structures, or information flows and the right skills and competences from our people, then that's not going to work well. And so these, on the left side, what we call enablers, are critical for the overall governance system to function properly. Areas of responsibility, going really with the main entity of governance, which is the governing body. What we see here is that, well, there's three common areas of responsibilities that are quite important. We kind of covered on the last slide the strategic aspect that is very important, because we need to have an idea of where we're going. But there's the other two aspects that are there. Generative, I mean, we have to deliver that value, and we have to maintain that over time. And so we have to make sure that any new ideas to continue to do what we're doing, but doing it better, are always present within an organization. Or if there's anything new that needs to be done because some elements have changed, that we detect that as well, and we do readjustments as well. And then there's the fiduciary aspect as well. So there, and we briefly saw it as well with the regulators that are there. Most organizations will have a level of regulations enforced on them, and it needs to be followed. And that means that the governing body needs to be aware of this, and that should influence to the direction that will be provided to the organization. And so we at least start on the right footstep and go in the right direction. So three important perspectives. So it's not just about being able to get with those strategic plans, but it's to talk about and cover well the two other elements here as well. Now, we saw principles before, policies. When we talk about governance system, one of the key aspects is that we, part of that direction, lay out the exact foundations of what we believe we need to do, why we need to do it, and to some degree on how we plan on being able to do it too. And so we have a few examples here, typical type of principles that organizations are going to pick for their very top level of principles to their governance system. So mandate purpose, which is going to lead from a strategic perspective, the organization, but authority as well. I mean, if authority is not well defined within an organization, we're not going to perform so well. And there's going to be a lot of time wasted to find out who has the authority to approve anything that we have to do. In my description before of the top level going down to the operational level and feeding back to the top. I mentioned accountabilities. And this is very important. And for some organizations, even more important than others. And often it has to be part of that list of principles that we may want to include within the organization. Some others may be a bit more familiar is performance assessment, risk, which I just mentioned before, but full disclosure. I mean, how many times you've seen organizations in the news and then faced with the truth that comes out, which was somewhat kept, quiet in the background, and then it comes and bite you back. And that affects a lot of organizations when this information should have been disclosed and should have been made more available to different stakeholders. So that is one of the area where often organizations are going to choose to have as well a specific principle to guide on how then they should approach that aspect of being open, transparency with, again, the different stakeholders that needs to have the level or the different level of disclosures as well. Last one at the bottom that I wanted to highlight is the social responsibility, which, I mean, always been there, but too often has been left as somewhat a secondary or even third level priority principle, set of principle. And now more we move forward, more we see that this is becoming one of the top, in fact, type of principle for organization, where we're starting to realize that, well, yes, we exist because we have the people. And that's the source that makes our organization to function. And if we don't take care of our people, then that doesn't work well. And so the social responsibility is getting quite a bit more predominant. Maybe one thing as well that I would like to add here that goes really well and closely related to social responsibility, which is also another set or type of principle. It's the one related to the environment, where it starts now to keep coming and have a place in governance systems for many organizations, where, yes, socially responsible, and by extension that includes not just people but the planet as well, and so the whole environment that we're living in, which is part as well of the concept of a social aspect, because, well, as individual, we live on that planet, we breathe that air, we drink that water, and well, we know that for some organizations in the past, or even up to this point, it's not always a high priority, and maybe it should be more. So multiple aspects that needs to be really covered when we're talking about governance. Now, where do we start? I mean, it's a good thing to see that, yeah, we need to have some kind of system in place to help us, but what tools, what knowledge do we have access that we could use within an organization to help us to define if what we think we have as a governance system is sufficient, or if what we have possibly needs to be modified. And I'm starting with the two ISO standards or series of standards here, which is the 38500 and the 37000 standards. The first one, 37000, and I have a bit to be careful a bit on how far I was going to go with revealing some of the details, because we're still writing it at ISO. We're in the last stages. This standard, as you see here, it's guidance for the governance of organizations. It's been initiated within ISO as a mother type of standards that looks at governance from the very top of any type of organization, and is there to provide guidelines on the key principles that should be really relevant for any type of organization. And so that's key principles that, as an organization, we're now presented with, and we could decide how relevant it is to us, and then looked at the guidelines that are there with, again, relevant practices, proper frameworks, structure of governing bodies, and how can we make it happen if we agree that this or these few principles apply to us. We expect that this standard should probably be published and available to the general public by the end of this year or very early next year. We're in the last stage of review of that document. And in November, in fact, we're going to take comments coming from multiple national bodies, multiple country experts around the world on that final review. Then it'll be a matter of consolidating of those comments into a last version that will be then approved by ISO and published. So it's coming very soon. A few highlights here. So I just mentioned it is principle-based. It is also driven by outcomes. So the idea of the standard is that we looked at, well, what are the major outcomes that any organization should be looking for achieving? And we talked about performance, so effective performance, responsible stewardship, and ethical behavior. And so we define these as the driving force for that standard. And we came out with a list of principles that we're going to be able to support the achievement of those outcomes, which again should fit really any type of organization. It does touch the aspect of governance, both governance and management, and as that they're distinct, but they are complementary, very much as I mentioned before. The principles where we have 11 of them. So there's 11 principles. They're divided in two categories. So we'll have foundational principles that are really essential to most organizations. And then we're going to have as well enabling governance principles that are also quite essential to any organization. So there was a little effort to define those two types of principles to help organizations to see, well, from a foundational perspective, what exactly should I have? And if I want to some degree, enable my organization to even do better, what additional principle could I use to guide us? So that's the first standard. So not yet available to you, but very soon will be available. The other one is the 38500. Now you may have noticed that the other 37,000 standard I just introduced was written as an ISO 37,000. This one is written as ISO/IEC 38500. The first one is defined by ISO strictly, and it has an application to organization in general, all types of organization. When we talk about 38500, it was developed for organization that has to manage information technology. And it was developed in partnership between ISO and the IEC as well, so the International Electrotechnical Committee. And that's why the two abbreviations are there, part of that 38500. So it was experts from the two different organizations around the world that parted in the definition of this standard. Now this one has been around for quite a while. The last version that we have is 2015. And we're just about right now initiating the review of that standard. So within about 3 years, there's going to be a new version of that standard. Also principle-based, so very similar to the one for organization in general, and based on a governing body that is driven by three main tasks. And you will recognize what I was somewhat touching earlier on when I introduced governance: evaluate, direct, and monitor. Evaluate, know who we're expected to serve, what are the different key players, and then form up our raison d'être. So why do we exist? Then once we have that understanding, provide the direction. And then once the direction has been provided and things are getting into place, look at the monitoring aspect. And so that's the foundation really of that standard here. Within the standard is that somewhat an equivalent of that picture here that gives as well a good idea of the full-fledged scope of the standard and where it can help organization in defining their governance system. So as we saw before, yes, there will be influences that comes from multiple sources: customers, regulatory bodies, standard bodies, authorities, shareholders above some of these organizations. And the governing body has to make sense of all of those different requirements and needs. And that's the evaluation part. Once we understand all of that landscape, then we can look at providing the direction that we should follow within our organization. And that's when that goes to a critical part of any organization, and that's the management part that we call, where we need to now look at formulating our strategies, our strategic plans, the policies that will guide as well all of our people so that they get to do what they expected to do the best way as possible. You could see that, well, there's a validation of those plans. So there's a monitoring of what will be decided on how we're going to proceed, that again have top level their authorization to proceed with. But eventually it's all in place. And what we get back towards the top level is now the performance measures and the conformance as well when applicable. So it's possible that we don't have any regulatory body that force us to have some specific conformance, and it's more based on performance aspects. But the others is as well possible, and both of them for a lot of organizations. So that gives a good perspective of the whole model that is discussed in that 38500 standard. So 38500 is one standard that covers these areas here to help organization, again, to define a governance system, but from a strict perspective, quite directed to a technology type of organization. And there's a few additional details I wanted to just bring up to your attention as well. That standard principle base is supplemented by other standards as well in the same series, framework and model. So a definition of a framework for governance, the aspects of governance of data, and how more specific you should go with respect to data, part of information and technology. Governance when we're talking about IT-enabled investments. So that's again moving towards those digital transformations using information and technology. Implementation guide as well. And then upcoming parts specifically on how to assess an organization and define how we're doing from a governance perspective, so that we have insights on how well or how better we could do, and put us on a track of improvements as well of our governance system. So this is upcoming, should be published probably, I would say within a year. And then artificial intelligence and governance as well, which is also upcoming. And yes, I mean, I see the text there, information governance, very different, transition from record keeping, very different than pure data type of governance as well. I mean, data, those pieces of data, well, in isolation, they are what they are, and there's a level of governance. But once we take that data and we start to put it together and form what we could call more information, sometimes we need different approaches to be able to govern this properly. And who's going to have access to that information that comes from multiple sources of data and so on. So very critical aspect, and hence why there's a specific standard that has been developed for that too. So that was for the ISO standard. Now circling back to ISACA specific offering from a perspective of guidelines. You have easy access to all of the COBIT knowledge within the ISACA.org site. So I won't go too much in depth, but I want to highlight some key elements of COBIT 2019, the last edition of that framework, that you should really go and drill down. And we look forward for your suggestion as well, feedback on that session. And if there's any areas that you would like to maybe have another session, future session on a specific aspect, we're welcoming these comments as well. So COBIT 2019, this enterprise governance of information and technology, focus on one main thing, and it's the value delivery. when we transform our organizations to better use information and technology, that is. And the value delivery, by making sure that ultimately we are delivering benefits, but we're going to optimize risks. So that means we're going to be able to know what is acceptable to us as risk and which risk we need to mitigate. And we're also going to do that while we optimize the usage of our resources, which means that we're going to be effective, but we're going to be efficient as well, which means that the whole model could monitor both aspects as well as we move forward. So one main concept there of 2019 version of COBIT. It's a governance framework that is there as well to guide us as an enterprise, which means it covers governance, it covers management, and it covers any part of the enterprise as well. So in the past, people were inclined to think that COBIT in the previous version was dedicated to IT organization. It wasn't the case. It was already a view of enterprise, but the way that it was structured was easily pushing people to understand that it might be only for IT, but it wasn't the case. It was documented from an IT perspective, but it was able to be applied to any type of business units. So enterprise view within COBIT 2019. And again, covering governance and management. So as we saw it before, the top entity here that provides that directions based on the evaluation of the needs, and that needs to also be accountable to those stakeholders, but also the part at the foundation of that pyramid there, that is what we call management, where we have to make sure we can define the best plans as possible. We're going to build on those plans so that eventually it can run, so it can be operated and properly monitored so that the loop can be closed towards the governing body so that they could then be accountable as required. So COBIT, what it is, what is not. Yes, it's a framework. So it's a set of best practices on governance and management from an enterprise perspective. Multiple components that will help us to build our governance system and maintain it over time. They're covering as well factors that they call design factors to help you to define which one applies to you, and then guidelines on how to proceed with the definition of your governance systems based on those factors that you've identified that are applicable to you. And so very thorough guidance and flexible as well. Now, it's not the full description of a governance system for any type of organization. It's not neither a technical framework that pertains to IT. So it's generic as we saw before. And again, it's not there to help organizations to make their IT-related decision either. It's there for the enterprises to decide on how best we need to govern information and technology used across the organization. Supplemented by quite a bit of material. So you briefly saw that on one of the slides as well that Bob presented before. So yes, there's the core, there's the foundation of the model, but then there's all the series of documents that are to look in depth of all the management and governance objectives that will form your governance system. There's guidelines on how to design your governance systems, and there's guidelines on how to get to implement that within your organization. And fully aligned with external other frameworks, standards, and so on. So there is, and there was always an alignment between COBIT and the ISO/IEC 38500 standard. They worked hand in hand. A couple more slides to conclude. The goals cascade is one of the strong tools as well that you could find in the guidelines. And this is something that a lot of people struggle with. I see a point on cloud governance. Yes, with the AI part, there's also discussions for the cloud aspect as well within the group that develops the 38500. So there's some more advanced guidelines on that too. So the goals cascade here, Many organizations struggles with defining a proper performance management system that is linked ultimately to be able to provide a level of accountability to ultimately who drove what we're doing. And the goals cascade is defined within the COBIT guidelines exactly to help organizations to do this. So not to lose sight of those drivers and those needs as you define your enterprise goals, as you get to alignment goals for the different units within the organization, and as you get to define your specific governance and management objectives, forming your governance systems, which is what we're going to be reporting back on. So you follow that guidelines of the goals cascade. When you get to have in operation your performance management system, you will be reporting on what really is the most relevant part of the organization. And just for food for thoughts, as an idea of what the type of governance and management objectives part of COBIT 2019, you have them all here. So quite a few on these one, as you could see. And quite extensive documentation to help you as well to make sense out of all of these within the guidelines of COBIT. So that was what I wanted to introduce you all today. I've seen a few of the comments. I tried to answer a few of the questions as we went. If there's any other questions, I could certainly stick a little bit longer than 1 o'clock and answer any questions you may still have. And Bob, I'll pass the ball to you for as well the closing remarks, if there's nothing coming up.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. I'll give you a virtual thank you note. Okay. So do is no, it was very much appreciated. Gave us a lot of insights. I'm glad to hear. It'd be interesting to see if is ISACA involved in the development of those ISO standards, directly or indirectly?
Yeah, we have. Well, I am part of ISACA in the definition of some of those concepts of COBIT, and I was for a while, and I'm also on the ISO. So ISACA is using a lot of experts around the world, which a lot of them are also involved either with best practices like ITIL, TOGAF, project or program management expertise, or ISO standards too. So the short answer, yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I very much appreciated that. Does okay, I think Jillian just sent a message.
Yes, integrated governance. And as you could see here, I mean, we see that governance applies or is applicable at multiple levels. And there's going to be project or program governance as well. But ultimately, it starts at the top. I mean, the top management of the organization at the very top board level should provide that initial direction, which then gives that marching orders to everyone within the organization. And that's when then we get to, if we're focused on program, to then define our own program governance in line with the organizational one. If we're in HR, then we're going to have specific types of policies that will be in place again to align our governance on how we need to manage human resources within an organization. And the same thing for IT or any business units. But ultimately, it's all interconnected. And it's one what we call the system, the governance system, that gets to make all work together. If you look at it at multiple governance initiatives, you're going to have disconnection points. And that's when you have business units that are performing well, some that are not performing so well, some that are going in directions that are not exactly what we should be doing. That's when we see that integration is not there, not complete. And so you need to aim that integrated governance, and it has to start from the top. You cannot just decide from any business units on how we should operate and hope that it's going to be aligned with all of the other business units and the top level. So it's very much a top-down approach, which then feeds back up.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Steve. What happens is Steve can stay on a little bit longer if you have any other questions for that. Now,